I was late, as usual. The traffic was chaotic, and my head felt like a whirlwind of thoughts. When I finally arrived at the neighborhood cafe, I didn't expect to find Heather there, sitting alone, waiting for me. She looked beautiful, as always, with that smile that instantly disarmed me. As soon as she saw me, her eyes lit up, and she got up to hug me. It was a warm hug, the kind that seems to last forever, and yet not long enough. "You really came," she said, with a mischievous smile. "Of course I came. I wouldn't have missed it," I replied, trying to disguise the anxiety I felt. We sat down, and as we sipped our coffee, the memory of our last conversation came back to me. I had vented to her about my dissatisfaction with my marriage. Heather listened carefully, without judging, just supporting me. And there we were again, as if fate wanted to bring us together. "How about a walk in the park?" she suggested, with a twinkle in her eye that I couldn't resist. I agreed immediately. The park was our special place, where it all began. Walking along those trails always brought a sense of freedom, of being away from all obligations and problems. During the walk, I felt the physical closeness reflecting the emotional tension between us. Our bodies moved in harmony, as if attracted by an invisible force. It was then that our hands innocently met. That light touch, but full of meaning, made my heart race. We looked at each other, and our long gazes said more than words could express. "I miss you," she murmured, almost as a whisper. "Me too, Heather. More than you know," I replied, feeling the intensity of that moment. When the walk was over, the impulsive decision to go to her house seemed like the most natural thing in the world. The tension between us had become unbearable, and the only way to relieve it was to be together. With my heart racing and my mind filled with doubts, I followed Heather home, without thinking about the consequences of what was to come. The growing tension during the walk with Heather was almost palpable. As we made our way through the winding paths of the park, I felt the physical closeness between us increasing with every step. Our shoulders touched occasionally, and each touch, no matter how innocent, sent waves of electricity through my body. Heather stopped for a moment to admire a flower bed. I watched her in silence, the wind playing with her hair, and realized that she was so close to me that I could smell her soft perfume. She turned suddenly. Our hands met almost accidentally, and she smiled. "I missed you, you know," she said, her voice low and full of emotion. I couldn't respond immediately. The memory of our last conversation about the dissatisfaction in my marriage was still fresh in my mind. "I missed you too," I eventually said, my voice coming out huskier than I expected. We continued walking, but the tension between us only increased. Our gazes met frequently, and each time this happened, it seemed as if the world around us disappeared. At one of these moments, Heather stopped walking and stared at me. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" she asked, her eyes full of uncertainty. I sighed, trying to sort out my thoughts. "I don't know. All I know is that when I'm with you, I feel alive again," I confessed, the sincerity of my words scaring me. She didn't say anything, but took a step towards me, our faces centimeters apart. I could feel the tension in every fiber of my being, and I knew I wouldn't be able to resist much longer. Without thinking, I leaned forward and touched his lips with mine. The kiss was brief but intense, and when we pulled away, our gazes were full of desire and fear. "Let's go to my place," Heather suggested, her voice shaky but determined. I hesitated for a moment, but the passion I felt for her was undeniable. "Let's go," I replied, knowing that we were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Arriving at Heather's house, the initial hesitation overwhelmed me again. It was cozy, with soft music playing in the background, creating an intimate atmosphere. She guided me to the sofa, and without saying a word, approached me, her eyes fixed on mine. That first stolen kiss was unlike anything I had ever experienced. There was no room for doubt or regret. We gave ourselves over to desire, completely oblivious to the consequences. I knew I was entering dangerous territory. But at that moment, nothing else mattered apart from being with Heather. When I entered Heather's house for the first time, I felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement. I was hesitant, but the cozy atmosphere and the soft music in the background calmed me down a little. It was as if the place was embracing me, inviting me to leave my worries outside. Heather was next to me, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. She smiled and said, "Make yourself at home. I want you to feel at home." Those words were a relief, but also a reminder of what we were about to do. My heart was beating fast, and I knew I was in dangerous territory. We sat down on the sofa in the living room, and the closeness was palpable. Heather leaned over to pick up a remote control and turned the music up a little. "Do you like classical music?" she asked, trying to break the tension. "Yes, it's relaxing," I replied, almost whispering. I could feel the heat emanating from her body, and this only increased my anxiety. Then, without warning, she approached me and kissed me. It was a stolen kiss, unexpected, but full of desire. At first I was paralyzed, but the sensation of her lips on mine was irresistible. I reacted, returning the kiss with the same intensity. When we broke apart, she looked into my eyes and said, "I've been waiting for this for a long time." I didn't know what to say. Her words echoed in my mind, mixed with the memory of my wedding. However, at that moment, everything seemed distant and unimportant. I could only think of Heather, of us. Our second kiss was even more intense. Her hands slid down my body, and I felt a wave of warmth run through me. Every touch, every caress, was as if she was lighting a fire inside me, a fire I didn't want to put out. Without thinking about the consequences, I gave in to desire. Heather led me into the bedroom, where the music was still playing softly. Every movement was a dance, a choreography of passion and surrender. I forgot everything: the responsibilities, the consequences, the world outside. At that moment, it was just the two of us, exploring every inch of our bodies, discovering pleasures I had never imagined. The soft sheets, the smell of her perfume, the sound of our panting breaths. Everything contributed to a scenario of total surrender. Afterwards, lying next to her, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and guilt. Heather caressed my face, and I wondered how something so wrong could feel so right. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. "Yes," I replied, without much conviction. "I'm just thinking about all this." "Don't think too much," she said, kissing me again. "Let's enjoy the moment." And that's what we did. We gave ourselves over to that intimate encounter, without thinking about tomorrow. Time seemed to stand still, and I wanted that feeling to never end. Heather was a refuge, an escape from reality that I wasn't ready to face. When I finally left her house, I knew that my life had changed. There was no going back. I was trapped in a web of desire and betrayal, and in a way, I didn't want to break free. Heather had become a part of me, a part I wasn't willing to let go of. The increasingly frequent text messages began to dominate my thoughts. I found myself staring at my cell phone, waiting anxiously for Heather's notification to appear on the screen. Every time a message arrived, my heart raced. I knew it was wrong, but the excitement was uncontrollable. One afternoon, while I was sitting on the sofa in the living room, my cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Heather. "I'm thinking about you. I can't stop remembering the last time we were together." I felt a shiver run down my spine and quickly replied, "I'm thinking about you too. Every minute away seems like an eternity." The messages started to get bolder and bolder. Heather described in detail what she would like to do to me, and I could barely contain the silly grin on my face. It was a dangerous game, but the thrill was addictive. One evening, while my husband was watching TV next to me, my cell phone vibrated again. The message from Heather was provocative. "I can't get the taste of your lips out of my head. When are we going to see each other again?" My heart raced. I knew I had to be careful. I looked at my husband, who was distracted by the program, and quickly replied, "Soon, I promise." The adrenaline of hiding these conversations only increased the desire, but the fear of being discovered was also ever present. One evening, while I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, my husband picked up my cell phone to check the time. When he saw Heather's name on the screen, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who's Heather?" he asked with a tone of curiosity. "Oh, she's a friend from work," I replied, trying to sound casual while my heart was pounding uncontrollably. He seemed to accept the explanation, but I knew I had to be more cautious. Heather's messages became a delicious secret, something I looked forward to every day. At night, when everyone was asleep, I would lie in bed and read her words, imagining every detail. It was a refuge, an escape from the monotony of my marriage. One night, she wrote, "I wish you were here now, feeling the warmth of my body against yours." I was so excited that I could hardly sleep. I replied, "I want that too, more than you know." Those messages were my most precious secret. Every day, the connection with Heather grew stronger, and I found myself more and more involved in this dangerous game. I knew I was playing with fire, but the flame was irresistible. I woke up early that Friday, with my heart racing and my mind restless. I told my husband that I had a work commitment out of town and would be back late. He believed me, as always, without question. I felt a twinge of guilt, but the adrenaline took over as I got ready. I chose a discreet dress, but one that emphasized my shape, and applied a soft perfume. I picked up my bag and left the house, trying to keep my expression neutral. I arrived at the hotel a little before the agreed time. The lobby was bustling, but all I could think about was Heather. I looked around, searching for her among the people, and then, there she was, with a charming smile and a sparkle in her eyes that only increased my anxiety. She came up to me and hugged me tightly, and at that moment, all the nervousness seemed to disappear. "You look beautiful," she whispered in my ear. "And you're irresistible," I replied, trying to control my trembling voice. We headed for the elevator, and with each floor we climbed, the tension between us grew. When the bedroom door finally opened, there was no more hesitation. We kissed with unbridled passion, as if the world outside didn't exist. Heather pushed me gently against the wall, and her hands slid down my body, awakening sensations I had never felt before. I dreamt about it, I confessed between kisses. Heather smiled and looked into my eyes, her fingers entwined in my hair. And now we're here, living that dream. We moved to the bed, where reality distorted, and we gave ourselves over completely to desire. Every touch, every kiss, every whisper was an explosion of pleasure. I felt alive in a way I had never experienced before. Heather knew all my sensitive spots, and the way she touched me made my whole body vibrate. We spent hours exploring our bodies, fulfilling fantasies I had never imagined living. Heather made me feel wanted and adored in a way that I had never experienced in my marriage. Every moment with her was a discovery, a new adventure that took me to unknown places. When we finally stopped to breathe, we lay side by side, our bodies entwined. The silence was comfortable, filled only with the sound of our breaths. "This is crazy," I said, looking up at the ceiling. Heather turned her face towards me and smiled. "But it's wonderful madness, isn't it?" I nodded, feeling a mixture of emotions. I was ecstatic, but at the same time, a twinge of guilt still lingered. However, at that moment, the joy and pleasure outweighed any negative feelings. "I don't want it to end," I confessed, my voice almost a whisper. Heather took my hand and squeezed it lightly. "It's not going to end. We'll keep finding ways to be together." Those words brought unexpected relief. I knew it would be complicated, that being with Heather meant living a double life, but the thought of not seeing her anymore was unbearable. After a while, we got up and got dressed in silence. The room, which had once felt like a refuge, now had an air of farewell. I looked at Heather as she fixed her hair, and a wave of tenderness came over me. "I never thought this would happen," I said, breaking the silence. Heather came closer and gave me a gentle kiss on the forehead. Neither did I, but I'm glad it happened. We said goodbye with one last kiss, and I left the hotel with a smile on my face and my heart full of conflicting emotions. The adrenaline was still coursing through my body as I made my way home. I found my husband watching TV in the living room. He looked at me and smiled. "How was the appointment?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the screen. "It was productive," I replied, trying to sound natural. I went into the bedroom and sat on the bed, feeling the weight of reality return. My cell phone vibrated with a message from Heather. "Are you okay?" I smiled and answered quickly. "Yes, I'm fine. I can't wait to see you again." I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and a feeling of peace came over me. I knew I was entering dangerous territory, but the idea of continuing with Heather was irresistible. I closed my eyes and put my worries aside, at least for that night. The morning after we met at the hotel, I felt the weight of the world on my back. I could barely look at my husband as he got ready for work. The smell of fresh coffee permeated the kitchen, but all I could think about was the night before with Heather. The memory of those moments was still vivid in my mind. The texture of her skin, the warmth of her kisses, the sound of her voice whispering my name. It all left me in a state of ecstasy and guilt at the same time. While I was setting the table for breakfast, my cell phone vibrated in my apron pocket. It was a message from Heather. "Are you okay?" My heart leapt. I read the message several times before replying. "I am. And you?" I sent, trying to stay calm. My husband came into the kitchen, and I quickly put my cell phone away. He kissed me on the forehead and asked, "Are you all right? You seem distracted." "I'm fine, just a bit tired," I replied, forcing a smile. He accepted the answer without question, which only increased my guilt. I finished preparing the coffee, and we sat down to eat. Each bite was hard to swallow. The guilt was eating me up inside, but along with it, there was an uncontrollable desire to keep seeing Heather. When my husband left for work, I picked up my cell phone again. Heather had answered, "I keep thinking about last night. We need to see each other again." My heart was pounding. I knew I should end it, but the thought of not seeing her again was unbearable. I quickly replied, "Me too. When can we meet?" The answer came almost instantly. "Tomorrow, in the same place?" I agreed, and so our next adventure was set. I spent the rest of the day trying to concentrate on my daily tasks, but my mind always went back to Heather. Every time my cell phone vibrated, my heart raced, fearing and wishing it was a message from her. When my husband came home in the evening, I tried to act normally. We cooked dinner together and talked about our days. I felt like an actress in a play, playing the part of a devoted wife, while my mind was miles away, with Heather. "You've been different lately," he commented as we washed the dishes. "Are you sure everything's all right?" "Yes, I'm just a bit stressed about work," I lied, avoiding his gaze. He accepted the answer again, but I could see that he was beginning to get suspicious. This made me even more nervous, but also more determined to see Heather. Guilt and desire were at war inside me, and I didn't know which one would win. The next morning, I woke up with a mixture of anxiety and excitement. I couldn't wait to see Heather again, but the remorse was still there, a dark shadow that I couldn't shake off. I prepared breakfast for my husband, trying to act normal, but my mind was far away. "Do you have plans today?" he asked casually. "No, nothing special, just the usual stuff," I replied, trying to sound carefree. He gave me a kiss and left for work. As soon as he left, I started getting ready to meet Heather. I carefully chose my clothes, put on perfume, and left the house with my heart racing. When I arrived at the hotel, Heather was already there, waiting for me in the lobby. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, and she smiled. That smile melted all my defenses. "Hi," she said, pulling me into a hug. "I missed you." "Me too," I murmured, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. We went up to the bedroom, and as soon as the door closed, we threw ourselves into each other's arms. Passion overtook us, and for a few hours, I forgot everything. I forgot about guilt, about my husband, about the world outside. There was only Heather and me. Then we lay in bed, exhausted but happy. She ran her hand over my face and asked, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I'm just confused," I admitted. She nodded, understanding. I know. I feel the same way, but I can't stop thinking about you." "I can't either," I confessed, feeling tears forming in my eyes. "But it's so complicated." "We'll find a way," she said, kissing my forehead. "We'll find a way to make it work." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could keep seeing each other without anyone getting hurt. But deep down, I knew it was impossible. Even so, I couldn't resist her. Desire was stronger than guilt. We got dressed and left the hotel, promising to meet again. As I walked home, I felt the weight of guilt wash over me again. But along with it, there was a decision. I would continue to see Heather, despite everything. The desire was uncontrollable, and I was willing to pay the price for it. The routine of secret meetings with Heather became a vital part of my life. At first, it was difficult to adjust my daily life to accommodate these forbidden moments. But gradually, I found ways to make it all work. It became almost second nature to create plausible excuses and find windows of time in which I could escape without arousing my husband's suspicions. Heather and I would meet in places no one could have imagined. First, we started out in secluded cafes, where we exchanged complicit glances and smiles that spoke more than 1,000 words. Gradually, we moved on to explore less busy parks and even small motels, where we could lose ourselves in each other without fear of being seen. The trust between us grew with each encounter. I felt I could tell her everything. Heather became my accomplice and confidant, someone who understood my frustrations and deepest desires. "You're the only one who really understands me," I would say to her, as our fingers intertwined under the table of a remote restaurant. "I feel the same way," she replied, with those eyes that seemed to see into my soul. "I never thought I'd find someone like you." This complicity created a bond so strong that I sometimes found myself torn between two different realities. During the day, I was the devoted wife, looking after the house and husband. But at night, or in furtive moments, I became a woman in love, living another life with Heather. "How do you cope with all this?" Heather asked once, while we were lying on a bed in a hotel tucked away on the outskirts of town. "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "Sometimes it feels like I'm going mad. But when I'm with you, everything makes sense." The truth was that this double life filled me in a way I had never felt before. Despite the guilt, the excitement and desire were uncontrollable. I found myself smiling to myself as I remembered the moments we spent together. The laughter, the forbidden touches, the ardent kisses. "Have you thought about how this could end?" Heather asked, in one of our quiet moments, as we gazed at the stars through the hotel room window. "I'd rather not think about it," I replied, turning to her. "What matters is now, and now I'm here with you." And so we created an almost perfect routine for our secret meetings. It was a delicate dance between the danger of being discovered and the euphoria of experiencing something so intense and real. Every text message, every quick call, every glance exchanged in public was a reminder that I was living something unique, something that, despite the risks, I wasn't willing to give up. The feeling of living two lives was overwhelming, but at the same time addictive. I felt more alive than ever, as if every meeting with Heather renewed something inside me. It was a mixture of adrenaline, passion, and a happiness that I hadn't experienced for a long time. "I don't know if I can live without this," I confessed to Heather one evening as we said goodbye after another date. "Neither do I," she replied, holding my face between her hands. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." And at that moment, I realized that, despite all the challenges and risks, I was willing to go on. Life with Heather had become an essential part of who I was, and even though I knew that at any moment everything could fall apart, I chose to move on. After all, some loves are like that: intense, complicated, and sometimes impossible to resist. My husband's first suspicions began to emerge subtly, almost imperceptibly. At first, they were just suspicious glances, as if he was trying to decipher something in my behavior. I tried hard to stay calm and act normal, but I knew that something inside me had changed. Heather had an overwhelming effect on me, and as much as I tried to hide it, some things got out of hand. "Man, you look different," he commented one night while we were having dinner. "You always seem to have your head somewhere else. Is everything all right?" I smiled, trying to look carefree. "Of course, love. I'm just a bit tired. Work has been so busy." He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he wasn't entirely convinced. I knew I needed to be more cautious, but the truth was that the excitement of dating Heather was intoxicating. Every time I received a message from her, my heart would race and I could barely disguise the smile that formed on my lips. One night, as we were lying in bed, he suddenly turned to me. "You've been going out a lot lately. Who are you seeing?" My heart almost stopped. "I told you, it's all work commitments, meetings, happy hours. Nothing much." He frowned. "I don't like it. You've never been that outgoing." I knew I needed to think fast. "Look, I understand that this is strange, but it's a phase. Soon things will settle down at work, and I'll have more time for us." He was silent for a moment, watching me. The tension in the air was palpable. I knew I needed to be more careful, but at the same time, I couldn't resist the idea of being with Heather. Every encounter was like a drug, and I was totally addicted. To throw him off, I started to create more elaborate lies. I said I had meetings in different places, that I needed to make quick trips for work. Every time he asked, I had an answer ready. But the truth was that inside, I was terrified. The fear of being found out was constant, but somehow, that only made it more exciting. One afternoon, as I was getting ready to leave, he called me into the living room. "Where are you going this time?" I took a deep breath. "I have a meeting outside the office. I won't be long." He came closer, looking me in the eye. "I hope you're being honest with me. I don't know what I'd do if I found out you were lying." My heart raced, but I remained calm. "You have nothing to worry about. I love you." He gave me a quick kiss and I left, trying not to show how anxious I was. On the way to meet Heather, my cell phone vibrated with a message from her. "Looking forward to seeing you. Can't wait." I read the message and smiled, feeling that mixture of fear and excitement. I knew I was walking a fine line, but I couldn't stop. Every meeting with Heather made me feel alive, made me forget all my problems. But with each passing day, my husband's questions became more frequent and more incisive. I had to stay one step ahead, creating convincing stories to allay his suspicions. At the same time, I had to deal with the guilt that was growing inside me. I knew I was being unfair, but the truth was that I couldn't imagine my life without Heather. One evening, after yet another secret rendezvous, I came home to find my husband waiting for me in the living room. "We need to talk," he said seriously. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Sure, what's up?" He took a deep breath. "I feel there's something wrong. You're distant, evasive. I want to know the truth." My heart raced, and for a moment, I thought about confessing everything. But the fear of losing everything I had with Heather made me back down. "There's nothing wrong. I'm just tired, stressed out from work." He looked at me for a long time, before finally sighing. "That's fine, but know that I'm watching." I went up to the bedroom, feeling a huge weight on my shoulders. I knew I needed to be more careful, more clever. But I also knew that I wouldn't give up Heather. And so I continued to live this double life, always on a tightrope, always with my heart racing, waiting for the next meeting, the next message, the next lie. The idea of a weekend away from the city to be together. Heather looked at me with eyes full of intensity and desire. "Why don't we get away for a while? Let's go somewhere where no one knows us. Just the two of us." The proposal hung in the air, tempting and dangerous. I knew that accepting would mean making yet another excuse for my husband. But at the same time, the idea of spending time with Heather, away from everything and everyone, made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt for years. "A business trip?" I asked, trying to hide my nervousness. "Yes, something quick, 2 or 3 days. He won't even notice, and it'll be worth it, I promise." Her smile was so convincing that, at that moment, any hesitation I had dissipated. "Okay, I'll do it." The days leading up to the trip were a mixture of anxiety and excitement. I drew up a detailed excuse for my husband, including dummy meetings and conference hotels. He seemed to believe me, but I knew that distrust had already been planted. Even so, the desire to be with Heather was stronger. On Friday, I left the house with a small suitcase, saying I would be back on Sunday evening. When I arrived at the meeting point, Heather was already there, with a beaming smile and eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready." The journey to our destination was filled with laughter, conversation, and furtive touches. Every kilometer that took us away from the city seemed to bring us closer together. When we finally arrived at our destination, a cozy cottage near a secluded beach, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt for a long time. That weekend was like a dream. We walked hand in hand along the beach, laughed, talked about everything and nothing at the same time. At night, we indulged in unbridled passion without fear of being discovered. Every moment was intense and full of meaning. "I wish it would never end," I whispered to Heather as we lay in bed, exhausted and happy. "Me too," she replied, pulling me closer. "But we have to go back, at least for now." When Sunday arrived, I felt a knot in my stomach at the thought of returning to reality. On the way back, Heather tried to reassure me. "We'll find a way to do this again, I promise." I wanted to believe her, but the fear of what might happen if we were discovered was impossible to ignore. When I got home, my husband greeted me with a kiss and a hug, but I could feel the tension in the air. "How was your trip?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Tiring, but productive," I replied, trying to sound convincing. He looked at me for a moment before nodding. "Good." Over the next few days, I tried to get back into a routine, but the memory of the weekend with Heather was always there. Every message from her made my heart race. "I miss you," one of the messages said. "Me too," I replied quickly, with a smile on my face. Despite my husband's growing suspicions, I decided to stay with Heather. The sense of freedom and passion I felt with her were things I couldn't ignore. Betrayal had become part of my life, but surprisingly, I felt no regret. Only the will to continue living those intense moments, even knowing the risks involved. Heather and I knew we were playing with fire. But for now, the flame of our passion was all that mattered. After the trip with Heather, coming back to reality was like a shock of cold water. The intense days we had spent together, away from everything and everyone, had created a bubble of happiness and freedom that was now about to burst. Waking up next to her, without the constant worry of being discovered, had been a relief that I knew couldn't last forever. When I got home, my husband was in the kitchen preparing dinner. He looked at me with a mixture of relief and suspicion. "How was your work trip?" he asked, trying to sound casual. But I could feel the tension in his voice. "It was tiring, but productive," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm exhausted." He nodded, but I saw in his eyes that he wasn't completely convinced. The realization that he was beginning to suspect something made me nervous. Over the next few days, my every move seemed to be watched more closely. If I picked up my cell phone, he was there, trying to see what I was doing. If I left the house, he wanted to know where I was going and with whom. The tension at home was palpable, and I knew I needed to be more cautious. Heather, on the other hand, seemed to sense my concerns. She would send me affectionate messages, trying to reassure me. "Is everything all right, darling?" she asked in one message. "I miss you." I replied carefully, always afraid that he would see the notifications on my phone. "I'm fine. I just need to be more careful," I wrote. "I miss you too." Despite the risks, I knew I couldn't give up Heather. Being with her made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt for years. The passion, affection, and complicity we had was something I couldn't find in my marriage. One evening, while we were preparing dinner together, my husband suddenly looked at me. "You look different," he said bluntly. "Something's happening." "What is it?" My heart raced. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to sound innocent. "You know what I'm talking about," he insisted. "You're distant, always on your cell phone, going out more than usual. What's going on?" I knew I needed to think fast. "It's just work," I lied. "Things are more intense, and I'm trying to deal with it." He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't insist any further that night. However, I knew I had to be even more careful from then on. Heather and I continued to meet up, always more cautiously. We chose increasingly discreet places and avoided any behavior that might arouse suspicion. The feeling of living two separate lives was exhausting, but at the same time, the excitement of being with Heather gave me the strength to carry on. One day, while we were together in a cafe far from the city, I vented to her about my husband's suspicions. "I don't know how long I can go on like this," I confessed. "He's getting more and more suspicious." Heather held my hand under the table. "We'll find a way," she said firmly. "I don't want to lose you." Those words gave me momentary comfort, but I knew that the situation couldn't drag on indefinitely. The tension at home only increased, and I increasingly had to create elaborate lies to justify my outings and cell phone messages. Despite everything, I couldn't feel any regret. What I had with Heather was real, and I wasn't willing to give it up. I knew I was playing with fire, but the passion and desire I felt for her were stronger than any fear or guilt. Every encounter with Heather was a risk, but also a reaffirmation of what I felt. And as complicated as the situation was, I had accepted that betrayal had become part of my life. It was a reality I was willing to face, because being with Heather made me feel complete in a way I had never experienced before. So, even with all the difficulties and risks, I decided to continue. Heather and I would find a way to make it work, because what we had was something worth fighting for. And so, between guilt and desire, I moved on, accepting my new reality.